I'd now like to welcome John Deighan. John is the CEO of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. You're very welcome, John.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. I'm sure there are an infinite number of lessons and inspirations that can be taken from reflecting on the Stations of the Cross. I thought tonight I'd like to take the opportunity to say a few words on the consolation that it often gives me in the context of working in the pro-life movement. The Passion of our Lord and his path to the terrible death on the cross in Golgotha is now very well portrayed to us in things like the Passion of the Christ and in the insights that modern science has now been able to show about the agony that was inflicted on our Lord in his passion and crucifixion. Just last week in St. George's Cathedral in Southwark, which is just along from the Spuck London office, I was looking at the exhibition they are presently having on the Shroud of Turin. It provides fulsome information on the nature of crucifixion, and they even have samples of the actual Roman nails that would have been used for crucifixion. You can almost, when you see them, you can actually almost picture them going through your flesh. They also have a replica of what it's thought the crown of thorns would have looked like. And some scientists have actually gone into the minute detail on every aspect of the crucifixion and the passion that preceded it. From the shroud, for example, the actual number of lashes that our Lord received can be counted. And it's been determined that the nails would have pierced the medial nerve of his hands and the tibial nerve of his feet. The pain would have been excruciating, and he hung on those nerves for several hours. Small details that we can easily overlook if we rush have been explained in incredible detail thanks to scientists. For example, that our Lord would have had to push himself up, placing terrible pressure on his pierced feet just to be able to breathe. The death of our Lord seems to have had an unimaginable level of thoughtful detail put into maximizing his pain, even to the detail of the crown of thorns, which deviously ensured that even seeking a little relief of his strained neck muscles by resting his head against the cross would have ensured that Jesus would have had an increase in the dreadful pain of those thorns pushing into his sensitive scalp. The blood in Jesus's wounds would have dried and adhered to his clothing in many places as he made his way towards Golgotha. And when they stripped off those garments, it would have actually ripped open those wounds again, making them fresh, raw, and tender. There was not an inch of his body that was spared unimaginable torment. We also know, however, from the spiritual writers and the centuries of reflection by the saints of the church, that these physical sufferings were so little in comparison to the spiritual suffering that Jesus endured as he took on the weight of the sins of humanity. For several hours, he slowly poured out his life to the very last breath. He gave up his soul only after enduring the maximum of torment, exhaustion, and abandonment. Yet somehow, reflecting on that does give us consolation. Ultimately, because it was not the end. The resurrection is to follow. In 1991, Pope St. John Paul II actually proposed to include the resurrection as a 15th station of the cross. It was to be an optional extra, and some people do follow that. To quote St. John Paul II in this regard, the way of the cross does not end at the tomb, but continues beyond it. The tomb is empty because the body of Jesus has returned to life in the splendor of the resurrection. In the risen Christ, suffering and death have found their meaning, and we too are called to share in his victory. To our secular world, they might find it macabre that we reflect on the way of the cross. St. Paul, after all, said, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles." But we hope and we find consolation in it. I certainly take inspiration in it, particularly when so often we find that the challenges, troubles, and pains of life can be exhausting. I'm sure all of you I'm sure, particularly, I think this is true of the pro-life movement, but I'm sure it's life in general. I'm sure we all have times when we think, I don't have the strength. I'm too weak. I don't know what to do. But Christ's example in the way of the cross shows a lesson that can encourage the right attitude in every possible experience of human frailty, or in situations where we lack resources or we lack ideas. Our Lord was eager to face his passion. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how constrained I am until it is accomplished, he said. He endured the hurt of being betrayed by one of those closest to him. He was abandoned even by his friends, yet he wanted to endure it all, and not just for the friends, but for enemies too. I often think of that suffering caused by the stripping of the garments, and I think that, opening up those wounds afresh, in a way illustrates the pain that sometimes can be associated for us with being willing to be stripped of our worldly attachments, to be without the resources that we have hoped in. The pro-life cause can often feel like a bleak, unwinnable via dolorosa, a way of suffering that we follow, the opposition of the world that we encounter, and even sometimes the hurt of the misunderstanding and opposition we receive from friends. It can look like there is no reason for all the terrible attacks in life, the senselessness of those committed to inflicting death through abortion, and even believing it to be a good. If you're involved in the pro-life movement, you're probably surprised that you can still be surprised at the levels of challenge and the new ways in which the culture of death can expand and the culture of life can be threatened. Sometimes the challenges seem so great, but the way of the cross is a particular resource for encouraging us. And each of us at different times will find new nuances, new inspirations that reflecting on it provide. I particularly like the 6 stations for a few reasons. One of them is that Veronica could do so little, but in the little she could do, she gave our Lord a ray of consolation amidst his dreadful suffering, amidst the crowd that were jeering and actually enjoying his misery. She gave a touch of human compassion. Many years ago, someone told me that during their prayers they had been reflecting on their exhaustion, and they just didn't know how they had the strength to continue with all the challenges of life. And they said to themselves, I have all the strength of a rag, which was an unusual phrase for this person. But just as they thought it, an image came to them of the cloth of Veronica being placed gently over the face of Jesus. And the message that came with that image was, even a rag can bear the image of Christ. In our pro-life efforts, we continue because we believe that every human being bears the image of God. And in some small way, we try to be an image of Christ to the world. The path of the pro-life cause may seem difficult, but it's the particular cross that God has invited us to carry, our chance to cooperate in his mission to save mankind. God brings good from evil, and somehow the greater good that our efforts in fighting for the cause will be revealed to us, just as the resurrection was revealed at the end of the passion of our Lord. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for a very thoughtful and hopeful reflection. And we can all do our little to be the image of Christ in this world. So let's then reflect on that. And please join us next week when we'll hear from Father Greg Murphy in the Diocese of Dunkeld. For now, thank you for praying with us and good night.